They are gone." The words, spoken in his aunt's carefully modulated tone of horrified discovery, sliced through the morning quiet of the London townhouse. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, lowered his newspaper, a frown creasing the space between his brows. The scent of coffee and beeswax hung in the air, a fragile domestic peace that was about to be shattered. "Gone?" he repeated, his voice flat. "What is gone, Honoria?" Lady Honoria Beaumont, a woman whose posture was as rigid as her principles, glided into the breakfast room. She pressed a delicate, pale hand to her throat, a gesture of practiced drama. Her eyes, the same cool gray as his own, were wide with theatrical alarm. "The emeralds, Alistair. The Blackwood emeralds. They are not in the safe." Alistair felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The Blackwood emeralds were more than jewelry. They were a statement, a heavy, glittering symbol of his family's history and power, worn by every Duchess of Blackwood on her wedding day and on the most significant of state occasions. His wife, Alara, had worn them just last night. He had watched her across the crowded ballroom, a vision in cream silk, the dark green stones resting against the pale column of her throat. She had moved with her usual quiet grace, a faint, melancholic smile on her lips that he had long ago stopped trying to interpret. She was the perfect Duchess, beautiful, well-bred, and silent. He had chosen her for those qualities, for the serene and untroubled surface she presented to the world, a surface that ensured his own life remained uncluttered by feminine hysterics or emotional demands. Now, that surface was threatening to crack. "That is impossible," he said, rising from his chair. The silk of his dressing gown whispered against the polished floor. "Alara returned them to the safe herself. I saw her." "Did you?" Honoria's voice was soft, laced with a poison he failed to detect. "Did you watch her turn the key, or did you simply assume as any trusting husband would?" He had not. He had been tired, irritated by the empty chatter of the evening, and had retired to his own chambers, leaving Alara to her duties. The vast, silent suite of rooms that separated them was a testament to the cool distance he had cultivated in their 2 years of marriage, a distance that now felt like a gaping chasm of ignorance. He strode past his aunt, his mind racing. He entered his wife's dressing room. It was immaculate, as always. The scent of lavender and rosewater clung to the air. The heavy velvet-lined case that held the emeralds sat open and empty on her vanity. It looked like a plundered tomb. He walked to the adjoining sitting room where the small, wall-mounted safe was hidden behind a landscape painting. The door hung ajar. "You see?" Honoria had followed him, her presence a grating hum of anxiety. She was the last to have them. "This is absurd," Alistair snapped, the cold knot in his gut twisting into something sharper. "Why would Alara steal her own jewels?" "Not her own, dear boy," Honoria corrected gently. "They are the Blackwood jewels, and perhaps she had a need, a debt, a secret. You know how these quiet ones can be, still waters and all that." For months, his aunt had been planting these seeds of doubt, whispers about Alara's supposed extravagance, her solitary walks, her long silences. He had dismissed it as the jealousy of a woman who had once been the mistress of his father's house, and now found herself relegated to the status of a guest. But her words had found fertile ground in the barren soil of his marriage. He did not know his wife. He knew her name, her lineage, the graceful way she walked. But he did not know the landscape of her heart or the contents of her mind. That ignorance now made him vulnerable to suspicion. He turned as Alara entered the room, drawn by their voices. She was dressed simply, her dark hair coiled at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, a deep, startling blue, moved from his face to Honoria's, then to the open safe. A flicker of confusion crossed her features. "What has happened?" she asked, her voice calm. "The emeralds, Duchess," Honoria said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "They have vanished." Alara's gaze met Alistair's. In that moment, he had a choice. He could have crossed the room, taken her hand, and presented a united front against the world and his meddling aunt. He could have declared his unwavering faith in her. He did not. Instead, he saw her through Honoria's eyes. He saw a beautiful stranger whose inner life was a complete mystery to him. He remembered her melancholy smile at the ball and mistook it for cunning. He remembered her silences and read them as guilt. "Where are they, Alara?" he asked. His voice was cold, devoid of any warmth, any benefit of the doubt. It was the voice he used with a dishonest tenant or a failing subordinate. The color drained from her face. The faint, polite mask she always wore dissolved, revealing a raw, stunned vulnerability he had never seen before. She did not gasp or cry. She simply froze, her blue eyes widening with a hurt so profound it was like a physical blow. The silence in the room became thick, suffocating. It was the silence of a final, irreparable break. "You believe I took them," she whispered. It was not a question. It was a statement of devastating fact. "The evidence is damning," Honoria supplied quickly, stepping forward. "A maid, dismissed this very morning for insolence, was found to have one of your brooches in her trunk. A less valuable piece, of course. A clever thief would create such a diversion, would she not? Sacrifice a pawn to protect the queen." The logic was twisted, but it was a logic Alistair could grasp. It was cleaner than the messy, unknowable truth of his wife's heart. He held onto it like a drowning man clutching a piece of wreckage. "Just tell me where they are," he said, his voice hardening. "We can handle this quietly. No need for a scandal. Return them and we will speak no more of it." He was offering her a chance to confess, to save face. He thought he was being magnanimous. He did not realize he was taking a priceless, fragile thing, her trust, her love, her honor, and grinding it into dust under the heel of his ducal boot. Alara looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not the serene Duchess of Blackwood, but a woman he had mortally wounded. Her gaze was clear, direct, and filled with a sudden, chilling contempt. She did not defend herself. She did not plead. She simply absorbed the accusation, the betrayal, and let it transform her. The soft vulnerability in her eyes hardened into something that looked like ice, or perhaps forged steel. She turned without another word and walked out of the room. Her back was straight, her head held high. It was not the retreat of a guilty party, but the dignified exit of a queen abandoning a corrupt court. Alistair stood frozen, the faint scent of her lavender perfume lingering in the air like a ghost. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of unease, a sense of having made a catastrophic error. But Honoria was there, her hand on his arm, her voice a soothing murmur in his ear. "You did the right thing, Alistair. It is for the best. She will see reason." But Alara would not be seeing reason. She would not be returning the jewels. She was gone from that room, and in a few short hours, she would be gone from his life entirely, leaving behind a silence far deeper and more terrible than the one he had so carefully cultivated. That night, the London townhouse was a tomb of velvet and regret. Alistair sat in his study, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, the fire crackling in the hearth. He had expected tears, a confrontation, a dramatic scene. He had received nothing. Alara had remained in her rooms, and a profound, unnerving silence had descended upon the house. He told himself it was the quiet of guilt, of someone plotting how to return the jewels without admitting fault. He refused to entertain the other possibility, that it was the quiet of utter devastation. He had not seen her since the morning's accusation. Dinner was a tense, solitary affair. Honoria had tried to fill the silence with chatter about the upcoming season, but her words were brittle, falling flat in the cavernous dining room. Alistair merely nodded, his thoughts a maelstrom. The image of Alara's face, the shock, the pain, the swift and terrible hardening of her expression was seared into his mind. He had married her for her placid beauty, for the way she looked on his arm, for the children she would one day provide to secure his line. He had treated her as the most valuable of his possessions, a flawless diamond to be kept in a velvet box and displayed when necessary. It had never occurred to him to inquire if the box was a cage, or if the diamond had a soul. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so potent it was nauseating. What kind of man was he? He, the Duke of Blackwood, master of 1,000 tenants and a dozen estates, could not master his own house. He had allowed his aunt's venomous whispers to corrode his judgment, had chosen the easy lie over the difficult truth of getting to know the woman who shared his name. He rose, the decision made. He would go to her. He would apologize, not for the missing jewels. He was still too proud, too muddled to fully concede that point, but for his coldness, for his failure to trust her as a husband should. He would demand they speak, break through the wall of silence that had grown between them. He crossed the hall and ascended the grand staircase, his steps echoing in the unnatural quiet. He reached her suite of rooms and knocked softly on the door. There was no answer. "Alara?" he called, his voice tight. "I know you're in there. Open the door." Silence, a cold dread, far worse than the anger he had felt that morning, began to creep up his spine. He tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open. The rooms were dark, save for the pale moonlight slanting through the tall windows. They were also empty, utterly, unnervingly empty. Her bed was perfectly made. The clothes she had worn that day were gone. On the polished surface of her writing desk lay a single folded sheet of paper. His name was written on it in her elegant, precise script. His hand trembled as he picked it up. The note was brutally short. "You have your wish. I am gone." There was no salutation, no signature. It was as cold and final as a death certificate. He looked around the room again, a frantic energy seizing him. He strode to her wardrobe and threw open the doors. Her gowns, a rainbow of silks and velvets, hung in perfect order. He pulled open the drawers of her vanity. Her brushes, her perfumes, her personal effects were all there. He ran to her jewel case, the one that had held the emeralds. Inside, nestled on the velvet lining, were all her other pieces, the pearls his mother had given her, the sapphire earrings he had presented to her on their first anniversary, a diamond bracelet from her own father. A thief would have taken these. A woman fleeing with a fortune in stolen emeralds would have taken these. She had taken nothing. Nothing but the simple clothes she wore and the small amount of cash she kept for incidental expenses. She had shed her life as the Duchess of Blackwood as easily as a snake sheds its skin, leaving the hollow, glittering shell behind for him to find. And in that moment, the full, crushing weight of his monumental stupidity fell upon him. The lie was not Alara's. The lie was Honoria's. The lie was his own, the one he had told himself for 2 years, that a marriage could be built on silence and surfaces. He sank into a chair, the small note crushed in his fist. The house was no longer just quiet. It was empty. He had not merely lost a set of priceless jewels. He had lost his wife. And he finally, belatedly, understood that she was the only thing of any real value he had ever possessed. A new, chilling thought pierced through his grief. Alara had seemed different these past few weeks, quieter, more pale. He had attributed it to her usual melancholy. But now, a different possibility surfaced, a memory of her hand resting protectively on her stomach. She was with child, he was certain of it, and he had driven his pregnant wife out into the world with nothing but an accusation and the clothes on her back. The nausea returned, acidic and sharp. This was not just a mistake. It was a sin, an unforgivable, monstrous sin. He was not just a fool. He was a monster. The 5 years that followed were a penance of dust, and silence. Blackwood Manor, once the vibrant heart of his world, became a mausoleum. Alistair walked its halls like a ghost, haunted by the echo of footsteps that were no longer there, by the scent of lavender that had long since faded. He sent his Aunt Honoria away, unable to bear the sight of her triumphant, grasping presence. He sent her to a remote dower house on the coast, her victory turning to ash in her mouth as she was exiled from the power she craved. He did not accuse her directly. He had no proof, only a soul, deep certainty that felt as solid as bedrock. His life became a hollow cord thing. He fulfilled his duties as a duke with a mechanical, joyless efficiency. He sat in Parliament, he managed his estates, he attended the necessary functions. But the man within the ducal shell was gone, scooped out and left empty on that moonlit night in London. The world saw a duke more serious and somber than before, a man weighed down by his responsibilities. They did not see a man being slowly eaten alive by regret. He had searched for her, of course. In the first year, it was a frantic, desperate campaign. He hired the best investigators from Bow Street, men who could find a needle in a haystack. But Alara had vanished as if she had dissolved into the rain. She had not gone to her family. Their inquiries were met with confused, hurt denials. She had not used her name or title. She had simply disappeared from the face of the earth. After 2 years, the frantic search slowed to a dull, persistent ache. He dismissed the investigators, their polite reports of failure a constant reminder of his impotence. The hope of finding her dwindled, replaced by a grim, solitary existence. The silence of his life was his punishment, and he bore it without complaint. Then, in the 3rd year of her absence, a small, seemingly insignificant thing happened. He was clearing out a desk in his London house, the one they had shared, and found a small book of poetry she had left behind. Tucked inside was a pressed wildflower, a common bluebell. He remembered seeing her sketch them once, remarking on how they thrived in the acidic soil of oak woods. It was nothing, a forgotten memory, but it was something of her, a tiny thread in the vast, empty tapestry of his life. The thread snagged in his mind. He began his own search, a quiet, obsessive quest. He hired a single, discreet solicitor, a man named Thorne, who was more scholar than detective. He did not ask Thorne to find Alara. He asked him to build a portrait of the woman he had never known. Thorne delved into her past, her correspondence before their marriage, her charitable interests. He spoke to her former governess, her childhood friends. A picture emerged of a woman who loved botany, who was quietly intelligent, who possessed a fierce sense of justice, and who had felt utterly alone in her gilded cage of a marriage. At the same time, Alistair directed Thorne to investigate Honoria. The inquiry was slow, meticulous. Thorne uncovered a trail of disastrous investments, of mounting debts concealed behind a facade of aristocratic pride. He found that on the morning of the emerald's disappearance, Honoria had paid a substantial sum to the housekeeper, Mrs. Davies, the woman who had discovered the brooch in the maid's luggage. The pieces began to fall into place, forming a sickening mosaic of greed and betrayal. It was in the 5th year that the breakthrough came. Thorne, following the faint trail of Alara's interest in botany, had been cross-referencing reports of mysterious newcomers with the geography of England's ancient oak forests. He found a whisper, a rumor from a remote village called Oakhaven, nestled deep in the western shires. A well-spoken lady, calling herself Mrs. Anson, had arrived there 5 years ago, alone and clearly in distress. She had kept to herself, eventually taking up work as a seamstress and laundress, and, the report concluded, she had a son, a boy of 4, with dark hair and startlingly familiar gray eyes. Alistair did not send Thorne. He went himself. The journey was a torment of hope and fear. What would he find? A woman who hated him? A child who would not know him? What right did he have to intrude on the life she had built, from the ashes of the one he had destroyed? He arrived in Oakhaven on a damp autumn afternoon. The village was small, a cluster of stone cottages huddled around a church spire. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. It was a world away from the perfumed, polished confines of his life. He left his carriage at the inn, the Gilded Swan, and walked into the village, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He saw her in the market square. She was bargaining with a farmer for a basket of apples, her head tilted, a small, wry smile on her face. The smile was not the melancholic one he remembered. This one was real, earned. She was thinner, and the fine, soft hands he recalled were now reddened and capable. Her dress was of coarse, faded wool, but she wore it with an innate dignity that no fabric could diminish. The serene Duchess was gone. In her place was a woman of substance, forged in hardship, beautiful in a way that stole the breath from his lungs. He felt a wave of shame so profound he staggered, leaning against the cold stone wall of the bakery. This was what he had done. He had taken a duchess and turned her into a village seamstress, forced her into a life of toil and want. Then he saw the boy. He was hiding behind her skirts, clutching a wooden soldier. He peeked out, and Alistair's world tilted on its axis. The boy had Alara's dark hair, but his eyes, they were Beaumont eyes. The same cool, clear gray as his own, as his father's before him. They were the eyes he saw in his own reflection every morning. This was his son. He followed them at a distance, his legs unsteady. They walked to a small, whitewashed cottage at the edge of the village, a plume of smoke curling from its chimney. A small garden, neat and well-tended, surrounded it. Through the window, he could see the warm glow of a lamp being lit. It was a home, a real home, filled with a warmth his own grand houses had never known. He stood across the lane, hidden in the deepening twilight, for what felt like an eternity. He was a trespasser here, a phantom from a life she had rightfully buried. But he could not leave. He had to speak to her. He had to know his son. Taking a deep breath that did nothing to calm the frantic beating of his heart, he crossed the muddy lane and walked to the door of the cottage. He raised his hand to knock and hesitated. What words could possibly bridge the chasm of 5 years of pain and betrayal? Before he could decide, the door opened. Alara stood there, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the evening chill. She had been about to latch the door for the night. Her eyes fell on him, and her face, which had been softened by the firelight, became a mask of stone. The warmth vanished, replaced by a glacial cold that was more terrifying than any rage. "You," she said. The word was not a greeting. It was an indictment. "Alara," he breathed, his voice hoarse. She did not invite him in. She stepped outside, pulling the door partially closed behind her to shield the boy from the sight of him. She stood before him, not as a duchess, not as a victim, but as a warrior defending her territory. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice low and tight with a fury that had been simmering for 5 years. "I came to find you," he said, his own voice sounding weak and inadequate. "I had to." "It took you 5 years," she stated, her tone laced with a corrosive bitterness. "Did you grow tired of your life? Did your aunt finally bore you? Or did you simply misplace another piece of jewelry and decide to blame me for it?" Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, and he deserved every one. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I know the truth. I have known for years. About Honoria, about the jewels, about everything." She gave a short, sharp laugh, a sound utterly devoid of humor. "You know? How convenient for you. And what am I supposed to do with this sudden revelation, Your Grace? Weep with gratitude? Welcome you into my home?" She gestured dismissively at the humble cottage. "As you can see, we are rather short on space for dukes." "Alara, please," he begged, taking a step forward. She immediately took a step back, her hand held up as if to ward him off. "Do not," she warned, her voice trembling with the force of her control. Do not come any closer. You gave up the right to speak my name or stand in my presence 5 years ago in a dressing room in London." From inside the cottage, a small voice called out, "Mama, is everything all right?" Alara's expression softened for a fraction of a second as she glanced back at the door. "Everything is fine, Arthur. I will be right in." She turned back to Alistair, her eyes blazing. "You have seen me. Your curiosity is satisfied. Now go." "He is my son," Alistair said, the words torn from his soul. "I saw his eyes." A fierce, protective fire ignited in her gaze. "He is my son," she corrected him, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but carrying more menace than a shout. "I carried him. I bore him alone in a rented room above an inn. I kept him from starving by scrubbing other people's floors and mending their clothes. He is mine. You have no claim on him." "He is the heir to Blackwood," Alistair insisted, falling back on the one thing he understood: lineage, duty. It was the wrong thing to say. Her face contorted with a pain so raw it was agonizing to witness. "He will not be your heir. He will not be a prize bull to secure your line. He will be a good, honest man who knows the value of hard work and loyalty. He will be everything you are not. Now, for the last time, leave us." She turned to go back inside. Desperation clawed at him. He could not let her walk away. He could not lose them both again. "I am not leaving," he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I will not leave Oakhaven until you have heard me out. I will not leave until you have seen the proof I have brought. I will sleep in the street if I have to, but I will not leave you again." She paused at the door, her back to him. For a long moment, she did not move. Then, without looking at him, she spoke, her voice flat and weary. "The inn is called the Gilded Swan. I imagine their stables are more comfortable than the street." She stepped inside and closed the door. The latch clicked into place, a sound as final as a prison gate slamming shut. Alistair stood alone in the cold twilight, the ghost of a home's warmth on one side of a wooden door, and the vast, empty wasteland of his life on the other. But this time, he would not retreat into it. He would stand his ground. The penance had begun. Alistair did as she had suggested, though he took a room at the Gilded Swan, not a bed in the stables. The innkeeper, a stout man with suspicious eyes, was flustered by the arrival of a duke in his humble establishment. The news spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. By morning, the entire village was whispering. The reclusive Mrs. Anson had a connection to a duke. The whispers were a fresh hell for Alistair, a public airing of the shame he felt. He had not only brought ruin to Alara's life once, he was now disrupting the fragile peace she had so painstakingly built. He did not approach her cottage again. He had promised to wait, and he would honor that. He sent a note via the innkeeper's boy, a simple, formal request to meet at her convenience, stating he had documents she needed to see. The boy returned with no written reply, only a verbal message. "She says you can wait." So he waited. He took his meals alone in a private parlor at the inn, the food tasting of ash. He walked the damp lanes of the village, a specter of wealth and privilege in a world of hard labor. He saw his son playing with other village children, a sturdy, laughing boy who was a complete stranger to him. The sight was a constant, twisting knife in his gut. He saw Alara as she went about her errands, her face a pale, composed mask. She never once looked in his direction. She had erased him from her world, and he had no idea how to write himself back in. After 3 days of this agonizing limbo, he realized that words would never be enough. He needed to show her. He sent an urgent message to Thorne in London. "Bring everything, the housekeeper's confession, the ledgers showing Honoria's debts. Bring the jewels." While he waited for Thorne's arrival, Alistair made a decision. He could not simply be a duke waiting in an inn. He had to shed the skin of his privilege, just as she had been forced to do. He went to the local woodcutter, a man whose hands were gnarled and stained, and asked for work. The man gaped at him as if he had grown a second head. "Work, your grace?" the man stammered. "What work could a man like you do?" "I can learn," Alistair said. "I will chop and stack. I will pay you for the privilege." The woodcutter, bewildered but unwilling to refuse a duke, agreed. The next morning, Alistair appeared at the woodcutter's yard, dressed not in fine wool, but in sturdy work trousers and a linen shirt he had purchased from the village tailor. The axe was a clumsy, heavy thing in his unaccustomed hands. The first few hours were a misery of blisters and aching muscles. The villagers stared. He ignored them. He worked until his back screamed and his hands were raw, the clean scent of split oak filling his lungs. He was paying a physical penance, and in the mindless, repetitive labor, he found a sliver of peace. Thorne arrived 2 days later, his carriage laden with document boxes and a small, heavily secured strongbox. He found his employer not in a fine parlor, but in a muddy yard, his face grim with effort, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. Thorne, a man not easily surprised, merely raised an eyebrow. "Your Grace," he said dryly, "an unexpected pastoral turn." "It is necessary," Alistair said, dropping the axe. He wiped his hands on his trousers, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Do you have it all?" "Everything," Thorne confirmed. Lady Honoria's confession, corroborated by the housekeeper, detailing the entire conspiracy, financial records, and this. He patted the strongbox. That evening, Alistair did not send a note. He walked to the cottage himself, Thorne trailing behind him carrying the boxes. He knocked on the door. This time, when Alara opened it, her eyes widened slightly at the sight of his changed appearance. He was no longer the pristine duke. He was a man who had been working, his face etched with weariness, his hands bandaged. "I have the proof," he said simply. "I will not ask you to listen to me. I will ask you to read." She hesitated, her gaze flickering from his face to the boxes in Thorne's arms. The curiosity, the part of her that needed to know the full shape of the cage she had escaped, warred with her pride. Finally, she gave a curt nod and stepped back, allowing them to enter. The cottage was small, but immaculately clean. A fire burned in the hearth, casting a warm glow on the simple wooden furniture. Arthur was asleep in a small cot in the corner, his wooden soldier clutched in his hand. The air smelled of soap and baking bread. It was the scent of a life, a real one. Alistair directed Thorne to place the boxes on the small table. He did not sit. He stood by the door like a supplicant. "I will wait outside," he said to Alara. "Take all the time you need." He stepped out into the cold night air, leaving her with the ghosts of their past. He paced the small garden, his boots sinking into the soft earth. An hour passed, then 2. The light in the window burned steadily. He imagined her inside, reading the dry, legalistic words that laid bare the sordid tale of greed and deceit that had cost them 5 years of their lives. Finally, the door opened. Alara stood there, her face pale in the moonlight. She held a sheaf of papers in her hand. "The housekeeper," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "She admits to everything, to taking the jewels from my case, to planting the brooch." "Yes," Alistair said. "Honoria paid her. She was deeply in debt." "And Honoria," Ilara's voice broke for the first time. The ice was cracking. "She is confined? Her assets frozen?" "She will never trouble you again," he promised. "She is under guard at a remote estate, socially and financially ruined. It is the most I could do without a public trial that would have dragged you and Arthur through the mud." She looked down at the papers, then back at him. The anger in her eyes was gone, replaced by a vast, hollow exhaustion. The fight had gone out of her, leaving only the deep, aching wound. "Why?" she asked, the question soft and full of pain. "Why did you believe her?" This was the question he had asked himself 1,000 times in the silent, empty nights. He had no excuse, only the shameful truth. Because I was a fool, he said, his voice raw with self-loathing. I was an arrogant, emotionally blind fool. You were a beautiful, perfect Duchess, and I treated you like a portrait on the wall. I never tried to know you, and because I did not know you, I could not trust you. It was easier to believe a simple, ugly lie than to face the complex truth of my own failure as a man, as a husband. The fault was not in your silence, Alara. It was in my deafness. He reached into the strongbox Thorn had left by the door and pulled out the velvet case. He opened it. The blackwood emeralds glittered coldly in the moonlight, their dark fire a mockery of the warmth inside the cottage. He held them out to her. They are yours, he said. They have always been yours. She looked at the jewels, then at his face. She did not take them. They are just stones, she said quietly. They are not what was stolen from me. He knew. He closed the case. I know, he said. I know I cannot give you back the years. I cannot undo the pain. I can only atone. He gestured to his bandaged hands, to the woodpile he had begun to stack near her cottage. I am not asking for your forgiveness. I have no right. I am only asking for a chance to earn it. Let me stay. Not as a duke, as a man. Let me be a father to my son. Let me show you, through action, not words, that I have changed. She looked at him for a long, searching moment. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, so faint and fragile he was afraid to breathe. It was a terrifying, beautiful thing. The woodpile is uneven, she said, her voice still quiet, but with a new note in it, something other than pain. And you will wake Arthur if you continue pacing the garden all night. She stepped back inside, leaving the door slightly ajar. It was not an invitation, not yet, but it was not a dismissal. It was a beginning. Alistair began to live a life split in two. By day, he worked. He chopped wood. He helped repair a fence for the innkeeper. He hauled sacks of grain for the miller. The physical labor was a balm to his tormented soul. It left him too exhausted at night for the ghosts to have their usual power. His hands, once soft and accustomed only to holding a pen or the reins of a horse, became calloused and strong. The villagers, who had first viewed him with suspicion, began to watch him with a grudging respect. The Duke was not playing at being a commoner. He was working like one. His real work, however, was the slow, painstaking process of rebuilding a bridge to his wife and son. He did not press her. He gave her space. He would leave a basket of fresh bread and cheese from the inn on her doorstep in the mornings. He bought a new, warm blanket for Arthur's cot and had it delivered, with no note. These were not grand ducal gestures, but small, practical acts of care. He began to know his son in fleeting, stolen moments. Arthur, a curious and bold child, would sometimes watch him from the safety of the cottage garden. Alistair would stop his work and speak to him gently, asking about his wooden soldier or the picture he was drawing in the dirt with a stick. He never mentioned that he was his father. He was simply Alistair, the man who lived at the inn and chopped wood. One afternoon, Arthur ventured out of the garden and approached him while he was stacking logs. "Your hands are bleeding," the boy observed with the blunt honesty of a child. Alistair looked down at his palms. A blister had broken, and a thin line of red seeped through the bandage. "Yes," he said. "It happens when you work with wood." Arthur looked at his own small, soft hands, then back at Alistair's. "Mama's hands get sore too, from the washing." The simple statement hit Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He had known, abstractly, that her life was one of labor, but to hear it from his son, to have the image of her hands, chapped and sore from scrubbing other people's clothes, laid bare before him, it was another layer of his guilt. "Your mother is a very strong woman," Alistair said, his voice thick. "She is the strongest," Arthur agreed readily. He then held up his wooden soldier. "His leg is broken. Can you fix him?" Alistair's heart swelled. It was the first time the boy had asked him for anything. "I can try," he said. He took the small toy and sat on a log, pulling a pocket knife from his trousers. He carefully carved a small sliver of wood to brace the broken leg, binding it with a piece of twine. He worked with intense concentration, as if the fate of his entire world rested on the repair of this tiny wooden man. He handed it back to Arthur. The boy inspected the repair gravely, then gave Alistair a brilliant, heart-stopping smile. "Thank you," he chirped, and ran back towards the cottage, shouting, "Mama, look! Alistair fixed him." Alara appeared at the cottage door, wiping her hands on her apron. She had seen the entire exchange. She looked at Alistair, who was still sitting on the log, his large, battered hands looking empty without the small toy. For the first time since his arrival, she did not look at him with anger or weariness. There was something else in her gaze, something softer, a reluctant warmth. That evening, as he was about to return to the inn, she called out to him, "Your Grace." He turned. "My name is Alistair," he said quietly. She nodded, accepting the correction. "Alistair, the nights are getting colder. There is soup on the hearth. It would be a shame to let it go to waste." It was an invitation, a fragile, tentative one, but an invitation nonetheless. He walked into the small, warm cottage, his heart thudding. He sat at the simple wooden table where she and Arthur took their meals. She ladled soup into a bowl for him. It was thick with vegetables and barley, the most delicious thing he had ever tasted. They ate in silence, but it was not the cold, empty silence of their marriage. It was a watchful, waiting silence. Arthur, already in his nightshirt, chattered happily about his repaired soldier, providing a bridge of innocent noise between the two quiet adults. When the meal was over, Alistair stood to leave. "Thank you, Alara," he said, "for the soup." "You earned it," she replied, her gaze steady. "The woodpile is almost complete." It became their new routine. He would work during the day, and some evenings she would invite him in for a simple meal. They began to talk, not about the past, not yet. They talked about the village, about the weather, about Arthur. He told her about his attempts to fix the inn's leaking roof. She told him about Mrs. Gable, the midwife who had been so kind to her, and her struggles with arthritis. He was learning the shape of her life, the names and faces that populated her world. He was seeing her not as a duchess, but as Alara, a woman who was respected and loved in this small community she had made her own. The moment of true breaking came a few weeks later. A sudden autumn storm blew in, bringing with it a driving, icy rain. Alistair was caught out in it, finishing a repair on her garden gate. He was soaked through and shivering by the time he was done. As he turned to go, Arthur, who had been watching from the window, fell. It was a simple, clumsy tumble, but he let out a sharp cry of pain. Alistair and Alara reached him at the same time. The boy had scraped his knee badly on the stone step. It was bleeding freely. Tears streamed down Arthur's face. He looked at his mother, then he looked at Alistair, his small face a mask of pain. Instinct took over. Alistair knelt in the mud, heedless of his fine clothes, and gathered his son into his arms. "Hush now, little man," he murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "It is just a scrape. We will get you cleaned up." He held his son close, rocking him gently. Arthur, who had only ever known his mother's comfort, buried his face in Alistair's shoulder and sobbed. Over the boy's head, Alistair's eyes met Alara's. She was looking at him, at this man who had been a duke, kneeling in the mud, his face full of nothing but pure, unguarded paternal love for the child in his arms. And in that moment, the last of the ice around her heart melted. She saw not the man who had betrayed her, but the man who had spent weeks atoning, the man who loved his son with a fierce, desperate tenderness. Later that night, after Arthur was asleep, his scraped knee bandaged, they sat by the fire. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cottage there was a profound peace. "He called for you," she said softly. "When he fell, he looked for you." "I know," Alistair said, his voice thick with emotion. "5 years ago," she began, her voice steady, "you asked me why I would steal the jewels. You thought it was about money, about debt. You did not understand." "I understand now," he said. "I was a fool." "I did not need your wealth," she continued, her gaze fixed on the flames. "I needed your trust. I did not need your title. I needed your heart. That was what was stolen from me, Alistair. Not the emeralds. Your faith in me." He could not speak. He could only nod, the truth of her words a fresh wound. "You have worked to earn it back," she said, finally turning to look at him. Her eyes were clear, the deep blue no longer clouded by pain. "Chopping wood, mending gates, fixing a little boy's toy. You did not try to buy my forgiveness with your fortune. You tried to earn it with your hands, with your time." She reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his. Her touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him that reached the coldest corners of his soul. "I think," she said, a small, tremulous smile touching her lips, "that you may have succeeded." It was not a grand declaration. It was not a fairy tale ending. It was something far more precious. It was a conscious, deliberate choice. It was earned forgiveness. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her calloused knuckles. "We can go home, Alara," he whispered. "To Blackwood, all of us." "Only if it is a home," she replied, her gaze intense. "Not a gilded cage, a place where we are partners, where our son can get mud on his knees and be loved for who he is, not for the title he will one day inherit." "I swear it," he said, his voice ringing with the force of his conviction. "On my life, I swear it." Their return to Blackwood Manor was not a triumph, but a quiet reclamation. Alistair dismissed the staff who had been loyal to Honoria, replacing them with people chosen for their character, not their deference. He brought Mrs. Gable from Oakhaven, installing her in a comfortable cottage on the estate, with a generous pension that would see her live out her days in comfort. The great, echoing halls of the manor began to fill with new sounds, the sound of a child's laughter, the sound of Alistair and Alara talking late into the night, filling in the 5-year gap not with accusations, but with stories. He learned about Arthur's first steps, his first words. She learned about the crushing loneliness that had been Alistair's constant companion. They were not the same people who had left this house. He was no longer the arrogant, emotionally detached Duke. He was a man humbled by his mistakes, his love for his family, now the grounding force of his existence. And she was no longer the silent, melancholic Duchess. She was a woman of formidable strength and resilience, her voice now clear and confident in the running of her house and the raising of her son. She was his partner, his equal in all things. One evening, months after their return, Alistair came into the library. A fire roared in the hearth, chasing away the autumn chill. Alara was not sitting stiffly in a chair, but curled on a sofa, reading a book. Arthur was on the floor, building a lopsided tower of blocks. It was a scene of simple, domestic peace, a peace Alistair had once thought he neither needed nor deserved. On the mantelpiece, in its velvet case, sat the Blackwood emeralds. They had not been locked away in a safe. Alara had placed them there, in the heart of their home. They were no longer a symbol of oppressive lineage or a painful reminder of betrayal. They were a testament to what they had survived. Just stones, as she had said, but stones that marked a boundary between the past and the future. Alistair crossed the room and sat on the floor next to his son, helping him place another block on his precarious tower. He did not need to speak. He simply looked at Alara over the top of Arthur's dark head, and his eyes were filled with a love that was deeper and more profound than he had ever imagined possible. It was a love born not of duty or possession, but of gratitude, respect, and a hard-won, miraculous second chance. She met his gaze, and the smile she gave him was not the sad, polite smile of the Duchess in the ballroom. It was the real, warm smile of the woman in the cottage, a smile that reached her eyes and filled the room with a light brighter than any fire, more brilliant than any jewel. The silence in the room was not empty. It was full. It was home.